Good evening and welcome to The Bottom Line, a wrap of some of your top business news stories of the day. As usual, we begin with the number of the day. Today, that number is 6.73 million. That's how many South Africans were unemployed in the third quarter of 2019. And those are, of course, the last confirmed numbers we have from Statistics South Africa on how many South Africans are unemployed, or 29.1% of working-age South Africans who are not employed. Of course, when that number came out, many were horrified, as that's the highest level of unemployment since that data began to be captured in that way in 2008. So the unemployment rate in South Africa averaged 25.77% from 2000 until 2019, according to Trading Economics. The number of South Africans who have been unemployed has been increasing since 2008. It's been said by South Africa Open Data to have increased by 3.3% in the last 10 years. So we know that there is a huge problem that's taking place in terms of our unemployment and our labor. An economist who's just written about that is Xhanti Payi, joins me now. Thanks so much for your time on the 4View this evening.
It's good to be here.
So when looking at high unemployment rates, NEDLAC says, and I quote, inflexible labour market conditions and minimum wages are co-producers of South Africa's consistently high level of unemployment as labour prices itself out of the market. Do you think that's a correct characterization of why we're seeing such numbers?
No, I would not say so. I think that it's a little bit unfair in the sense that if you look at the minimum wage, right, much of the minimum wage that has been negotiated is actually below what many this is the national minimum wage that is below the minimum wages that actually were negotiated before this in terms of sectoral agreements. So it's very hard, it's difficult for me to understand why they would say such a thing, because it's actually not true. And I think over a period of time there are a number of things that are there. There's no doubt, of course, that employers would say that labor is it's perhaps inflexible, and that's a structural issue in the sense that, of course, as things change, we have not kept up with making sure that we reskill people. We actually make sure that they are actually able to move between jobs as things change in the economy.
I'm glad you've spoken about reskilling. McKinsey did a study, and they said by 2030, around 1.3 million or 1.7 million people will be needed in jobs that require higher education and higher skills than we have at the moment. Is South Africa going to be ready to absorb that huge number of people and have that huge number of people who will be employable? And
that's a really, really important question, because I think we keep talking about the fourth industrial revolution. It's something that's going to happen to us, and really it will happen to us. But we have to change our mindset and ask ourselves, how do we take advantage of the opportunities as the labor market changes, as people seek different kinds of things. I mean, people shop differently, people are thinking differently about their lives. But I think there's also the opportunity on the other side, right? We continually need more food, we have the land, we have the water, so we have to think about how do we actually prepare for the changes that are happening for people, for example, wanting more, homegrown food, or shall we say, organic food. How do we make sure that we take advantage of those developments? So it's not just the technology and the high-level jobs. There's also some low-level jobs that are actually opening up. The point is, do we have a strategy? Are we ready? And I think to your question, I would say the answer is no to that.
Okay, so what does the future of work in South Africa look like, and when are we practically going to see that happening in front of us?
Look, I think you talk about NEDLAC. Last year, NEDLAC has had these consultations as we're working towards the Jobs Summit. And I think it's a very, very important thing to think about when we have the next Job Summit. What are the discussions that are going to be there? What kind of strategies are we going to think about? How is labor going to come on board to represent, workers in a way that actually advances their interests, that takes a look very clearly at the things that we're facing. I mean, the number you're reading is from a number of issues, right? Because we've seen the economy is changing. We are talking about whether or not we are, for example, if you think about what is going to happen at Eskom, many people are going to lose their jobs at that restructure. There's no doubt about that. There's certainly, in the way we do energy is going to change. Coal will be less and less, so miners will be taken out. But certainly we're going to renewables. How do we then make sure that people in the mining sector can be transferred, can be skilled, to be able to actually reskilled, to be able to take advantage of opportunities in the renewable sector? All these kinds of questions are something that we have to start thinking about, and that I think labor unions, certainly government and regulators, need to come on board and say, when they sit around those tables, these are the things that they are discussing, and not just narrowly on this idea that our labor is inflexible, or that it costs too much. But actually, how do we look at the future? How do we take opportunities, and how do we create the kind of future we think we want in terms of creating employment and work for people?
You wrote an article on rethinking labor, and I thought it was very interesting that you said we're not looking perhaps at how low growth and embattled consumers are also impacting on how people lose their jobs and the vulnerability there. If you can just talk us through that.
That's true. I mean, if you look at the story of Messmart, now Messmart is apparently closing down stores in two of their, shall we say, portfolio. The one is Dion, which is electronics. That's where the jobs will be lost. And certainly in the more lower LSM, so shops like bazaars, there's wholesalers, many of them in rural areas. Now that's interesting, because you would think that those are the areas where people are starting to get jobs, because if the economy is bad, most of us would stop maybe shopping at Woolworths and we would go to the more cheaper stores. But I think it gives you a sense that people, for example, are saving less. Remember, that's where people in Stockfellas, for example, would go and shop for December, big groceries. But we are seeing that actually that's less and less, because people are being constrained in terms of being able to save. So they shop as little as they can. They want smaller quantities. People are struggling. People are losing jobs on a daily basis. So actually, and we saw the number that came out on unemployment. That number suggests that, not unemployment, poverty. That number suggested that poverty had been increasing in South Africa. So that suggests that actually we have to think differently about actually how things are happening, even at the level of creating employment, of the level of starting new companies, where companies are going, so that actually when we regulate properly. When we think about increases in labor costs, we think very seriously and very differently about that. But I think not in a blanket way in which actually we sort of are unaware of the many changes that are happening.
For context, Dennis Webster has written in this article on New Frame about how the Bantustan patterns and how people used to live back then still affects employment figures today, because he says when you look at the Northwest and the Eastern Cape, they suffer from the worst unemployment, while Gauteng and the Western Cape are the only two where you see unemployment of below 40% rather. So my question is that also a valid explanation for the kind of unemployment numbers we're seeing? And if that's the case, 26 years into democracy, surely policy and political will should have gotten rid of that element of why we're unemployed.
And it's a very important argument. Remember, when we talk about growing the economy and creating jobs, or creating jobs and growing the economy, we think about investment. How do we invest? How do we make sure that people have access to areas of, to economic opportunities? And much of that only happens in the big cities, in Gauteng, certainly in the Western Cape, and that's true. And that actually economic opportunities are not being created in a useful manner, in a significant manner in Bantustans that had been actually predominantly rural. So we need to think about that very seriously, because even if we think about agriculture, where agriculture now is moving is actually talking about more urban agriculture. So people are starting to think about how they grow agriculture in areas where there's water. So you think in rural areas, Limpopo, the Eastern Cape are badly battered at the moment by the drought. Where is the infrastructure for that? Where are the dams? What kind of thinking do we have there? And so part of the discussion is to make sure that we invest properly and as quickly as we can, so that economic opportunities actually do flow in those areas.
Xhanti Payi, thanks so much for your time on The Full View this evening. Economist from Nassance Research joining me in studio there discussing the labour sector.